Having laid waste to the Timucua, De Soto marched his army north. In the spring of 1540, he approached a town near present-day Columbia, South Carolina. Cofitachequi, a farming community with a religious and social heritage reaching back to the ancient mound builders. The army's approach was monitored by the people of Cofitachequi. They hid what they could of their food stores and sent their elderly chiefess away to a town removed from De Soto's path. When De Soto reached the bank of the watery river, the niece of the old chiefess crossed the river to meet him. Relying on diplomacy rather than military force, she hoped to persuade the Spaniard to spare her people.
The mistress of her town and 8 of her ladies embarked in a canoe, which had been covered with a great canopy and adorned with ornaments. It was towed by a second one which bore 6 principal Indians and many oarsmen. In this manner, they all crossed the river. The mistress of Cofitachequi came before De Soto and, after paying her respects, seated herself upon a chair which her subjects had brought for her. She alone spoke with the governor.
Excellent, Lord. Although my possibility does not equal my wishes, for goodwill is more worthy than all the treasures of the world which may be offered without it. With very sincere and open goodwill, I offer you my person, my lands, my vassals, and this poor service.
Unwrapping a great strand of pearls from her neck, she presented them to De Soto. Struck with admiration, De Soto called her the Lady of Cofitachequi. But her generosity and graciousness would not prevent the plunder of her town. The Spaniards feasted on 600 bushels of corn. They looted the graves and temples for pearls. Then De Soto demanded that the old chiefess be summoned from hiding to gain her submission. Finally, a 21-year-old adopted son of the chiefess was pressed into leading the army to her. The Spaniards marched out of town behind the young guide, stopping sometime later in the forest to eat.
He began to grow morose and to sit contemplatively with his hand on his cheek. He gave some long and profound sighs. Then, as he sat in the midst of the Spaniards, he began to remove his arrows one at a time and very slowly. Observing that the Castilians were not watching him, he struck himself in the gullet in such a way as to inflict a mortal wound, and thus died instantly.
When the Indian bearers were asked why the boy had taken his life, they explained.
He realized that the act of guiding these people to his mother's present location was unworthy of the love she bore him.
The elderly chiefess remained undiscovered. But before resuming his march, De Soto took her young niece, the Lady of Cofitachequi, as his hostage. After days of traveling west, she managed a daring escape, even recovering some of the plundered pearls. De Soto would not pursue her. He moved on, crossing the Appalachian Mountains. In July, he traveled down a broad river into the territory of the Coosa, what is now northern Alabama. The Spaniards were amazed by the size and wealth of the Coosa nation, where a single day's march took them through 12 towns, each surrounded by vast fields of crops. When they reached the Coosa capital, they were met on the road by 1,000 men wearing great feathered headdresses and bearing their young chief on a litter. After replenishing their supplies, De Soto and his men departed without serious incident. With them, they would take stories of Coosa wealth that would become legendary in Spain. As the army headed west, they left behind one man too sick to travel, a decision that would shatter the Coosa world. On October 18th, 1540, De Soto arrived at the fortified town of Movila, in the territory of the powerful Mobile nation. The Mobile had been preparing for this moment. Inside a strong defensive wall replete with towers, a war council was in progress. Upon the arrival of the Spaniards, a man described as a captain general was sent out to confront them.
Who are these thieves and vagabonds who keep shouting, "Come forth, come forth," with as little consideration as if they were talking with some such person as themselves? No one can endure longer the insolence of these demons, and it is therefore only right that they die today, torn into pieces for their infamy, and that in this way an end be given to their wickedness and tyranny.
As he finished speaking, the Captain General was struck down with a Spanish sword. Instantly, thousands of Mobile fighters spilled out, driving back the Spaniards. Fighting so fiercely, they even grabbed the Cavaliers' lances by the blades.
The Indians fought with so great spirit that they drove us outside again and again. Elvas, Spanish chronicler.
But the Spanish soldiers broke through the town's fortifications with battle axes and drove the Mobile inside their homes. De Soto ordered the houses set on fire. Wind fanned the flames, engulfing the town in thick smoke, while De Soto kept the trumpets, fifes, and drums blaring. And yet, the Mobile battled ever more desperately. Women fought frantically beside the men, prompting one Spanish soldier to say, they fought with a desire to die. Finally, at sunset, after 9 hours of battle, it ended. Eyewitness estimates of the Mobile dead ranged up to 11,000. Bodies littered the streets between the charred remains of buildings. Even the Spaniards reeled in shock. One soldier emerged from the silence of the aftermath, frozen like a wooden statue, until he died. A Mobile fighting man hung himself by his bowstring, rather than be left to survive alone. 82 of De Soto's men died, and every one of his soldiers was wounded, many seriously. For a month, the army was forced to stop and recover. Then, as the surrounding Indian nations watched in horror, De Soto renewed his march. But his army had been weakened. The tide was beginning to turn. In April of 1541, the invaders reached the Mississippi River. There, De Soto heard stories of the powerful Natchez nation, direct inheritors of the grand Mississippian culture. Natchez influence, both economic and military, spread in all directions along the Mississippi. Their temple pyramids rose majestically along the banks of the rivers. The Natchez paramount chief, Quigaltam, was heir to the tradition of the great sons and spiritual head of a powerful religious aristocracy. His title was Son of the Sun. He was carried on a litter so his feet would never touch the ground. His head was flattened according to Natchez custom, and tattoos of black, red, and blue designs were etched across his body. De Soto, claiming that he too was a child of the sun, summoned the Natchez leader to the Spanish camp. Quigaltam sent back his reply.
With respect to what De Soto said about being the son of the sun, let him dry up the great river, and I will believe him. With respect to the rest, I am not accustomed to visit anyone. On the contrary, all of whom I have knowledge visit and serve me, and obey me, and pay me tribute. Quigaltam, Nace.
De Soto would never meet Quigaltam, or see the wealth of the Natchez. On May 21st, 1542, he died. His body was buried in the Mississippi. Over the following year, De Soto's army ventured as far west as Texas before returning to the Mississippi. There, they built a flotilla and headed downriver for the Gulf of Mexico. En route, they were met by 100 magnificently painted Natchez canoes arrayed in battle formation. Seated under canopies, fighting men dressed in vivid colors and wearing large headdress plumes drove the Spanish boats out of Natchez territory and downriver, where one tribe after another picked up the pursuit. The Spaniards reached the Gulf of Mexico on July 18, 1543, setting sail for Spanish outposts on the Mexican coast. For the American Indian nations, De Soto's expedition mercifully came to an end. But it would not be the end of De Soto's influence on the continent. 20 years later, another expedition would enter the southeast, this time to colonize. In Spain, the agricultural wealth of the region had become legendary. But the new arrivals found few people and could barely survive. In desperation, they traveled north to the land of the Coosa, where De Soto's army had passed through 12 thriving towns on a single day's march. But instead of the fabled towns, they found ruins and temple mounds deserted and overgrown. And instead of populations of thousands, they found only pockets of survivors.
Our village had once been very great and populous. But other men similar to you destroyed it and forced us to run away in fear. Nanepakana Kusa.
Unknown to De Soto, the sick man he had left with the Coosa carried a weapon far more deadly than Spanish arms. While the army carved a path of destruction through the southeast, a hidden enemy that would take more Indian lives than all the generals and conquistadors combined was secretly traveling among them.
The Europeans had tremendous immunity and resistance to the diseases that they had known for tens of thousands of years. Smallpox, even the plague, chickenpox, whooping cough, measles, mumps. The Indians had no epidemic diseases. None of these were there. Consequently, they had no immunities, absolutely no resistance. So a disease as simple as mumps that we think of today as a childhood disease, it would come into an Indian community and quite possibly kill off 20% of the village. Then the next year, another disease could come through, such as smallpox, and kill off perhaps 30% of the village. So the Indians were tremendously weakened by disease.
Knowledge was lost as elders died suddenly. Nations were thrown into upheaval. In less than 20 years, civilizations that had flourished for centuries swirled into oblivion.